let me tell you something slightly uncomfortable. Right now, this very moment, your body is full of waste. Not just the obvious kind you can see or smell. I mean microscopic debris, broken proteins that no longer fold correctly, fragments of cells that have worn out and fallen apart, chemical byproducts left over from breathing, thinking, moving, digesting, just existing. If you could shrink yourself down and look inside your own body, you wouldn't see something clean and polished. You would see something busy, chaotic, crowded, a place where things are constantly being built, broken, moved, and recycled. You are, in a very real sense, a living system that produces its own mess. And yet, at the same time, you are also cleaning it. That's the strange part. There is no moment where your body pauses and says, now we will begin cleaning. The cleaning is already happening quietly, continuously, without asking for your permission or even your awareness. So the real question is not, how do we clean the body? A more honest question is, what do we even mean by clean? Because we tend to imagine cleanliness as something static. A clean room, a clean surface, something that stays the way it is once it has been cleaned. But your body cannot be like that. Your body is not static. It cannot hold still long enough to be clean in that sense. A better way to think about it is this. Your body is not a thing. It is a process. Imagine a river flowing through a landscape. Water is always moving. Leaves fall into it. Mud gets stirred up. Microorganisms live and die within it. New water enters. Old water leaves. Now ask yourself, at what point is the river clean? Is it clean when the water looks clear? But even clear water contains dissolved minerals, bacteria, invisible particles. Is it dirty when it carries mud? But that mud might be part of a natural cycle, nourishing plants downstream. The river doesn't aim to become clean. It simply continues to flow. And in that flow, things are constantly being carried away, broken down, and transformed. Your body works in a similar way. There is no fixed version of you that remains unchanged while dirt accumulates on top of it. The you that exists right now is slightly different from the you a few moments ago. Cells have died. New ones have formed. Molecules have been rearranged. Even your skin, which feels permanent, is constantly shedding and renewing. The same is true for tissues deep inside you, in ways you never notice. So when people talk about cleaning the body, they often imagine removing something foreign, something separate from themselves, but much of what needs to be cleaned is actually produced by the body itself. It is not an invasion. It is a consequence of being alive, and that leads to a subtle but important shift in understanding. You are not a container that gets dirty over time. You are a system that continuously creates, transforms, and removes its own internal clutter. The question, then, is not how to impose cleanliness on the body from the outside, but how this internal process manages to work at all, and under what conditions it begins to struggle. Let's zoom in a little closer, past what you can see, past organs and tissues, down into something much smaller. Inside each of your cells, there is an ongoing process with a rather strange name. Autophagy. The word literally means self-eating, which sounds destructive, almost alarming. But it's not destruction in the way we usually think of it. It's careful, selective, and surprisingly intelligent. To understand it, imagine a city. Not a clean, futuristic one, but a real working city. Machines are running all the time. Factories are producing goods. Vehicles are moving constantly. And like any real system, things begin to wear out. A machine overheats. A part breaks. Something becomes inefficient or even dangerous if left unattended. Now, suppose this city has a highly efficient recycling department. Not just a garbage collector, but something more precise. It identifies which machines are no longer working properly, takes them apart piece by piece, saves the usable components, and safely disposes of the rest. That's essentially what is happening inside your cells. Proteins, for example, are not permanent structures. They fold into specific shapes to do their jobs, but over time those shapes can become unstable. They misfold. They stick together. They stop functioning correctly. Left alone, they would accumulate and interfere with everything around them. Autophagy is the system that notices this. It encloses the damaged material, breaks it down into smaller parts, and then releases those parts back into the cell to be reused. It's not just cleaning, it's recycling with purpose. Even larger structures inside the cell, like worn-out mitochondria, the components responsible for energy production, can be taken apart and replaced through similar processes. What makes this fascinating is that the cell is not waiting for an external signal telling it what to clean. It is constantly monitoring itself. It has internal criteria for what is useful and what is no longer functioning properly. But here's where things become more subtle. This process is not running at maximum intensity all the time. It adjusts if the cell senses that resources are abundant, plenty of energy, plenty of building blocks. It tends to focus more on growth and production. New components are made. Systems expand, activity increases, but if resources become limited, the priorities shift. Instead of building new structures, the cell begins to look inward. It becomes more conservative, more efficient. It starts breaking down older or damaged components, not just to remove them, but to reuse what it can. This shift is not a conscious decision, of course. It's an automatic response to conditions, and this is where many misunderstandings begin. People often imagine that cleaning the body means adding something from the outside, a special substance, a particular food, some external agent that goes in and scrubs everything clean. But at this level, nothing like that is happening. The system that does the cleaning is already built in. It doesn't need to be imported. It needs to be allowed, and that raises a deeper question. If such an elegant and essential system exists within us, quietly maintaining order in the middle of constant activity, what determines how well it works? Not in a simplistic sense, but in the complex, dynamic environment of a living organism where countless signals interact at once. Because whatever the answer is, it won't be a single switch or a simple trick. It will be something more subtle. Something that depends on the conditions we create, often without realizing it. If we strip away the complexity and look at the pattern underneath, something surprisingly simple begins to appear. Your body, at a very broad level, behaves as if it has two general modes of operation, not two rigid states, but two tendencies that shift depending on conditions. One is a mode of building. The other is a mode of maintenance. When energy and nutrients are readily available, the system leans toward building. Cells receive signals that say, in effect, resources are plentiful. This is a good time to grow. New proteins are assembled. Cells divide. Tissues repair by adding new material. Energy is stored for later use. This is not a mistake. Growth is essential. Without it, you couldn't heal from injury, adapt to stress, or even maintain basic function. But growth has a cost. Every time something is built, something else is used up. Every reaction produces byproducts. Every structure, no matter how well made, will eventually wear down. So alongside this building tendency, there is another one, less obvious, but just as important. When incoming energy decreases, or when the system senses that external supply is limited, the priorities begin to shift. Instead of focusing outward on expansion, the body turns inward. It begins to conserve. And more interestingly, it begins to reorganize. This is where processes like autophagy become more active. Not because something has gone wrong, but because the conditions now favor efficiency over expansion. To make this intuitive, imagine a workshop. If that workshop is receiving a constant stream of new materials, wood, metal, tools, it will stay busy producing new things. There's little incentive to stop and examine every old tool or broken piece lying in the corner. As long as the supply keeps coming, it's easier to just keep building. But now imagine the supply slows down. No new materials arrive for a while. Suddenly, the workshop behaves differently. Workers begin looking around. That pile of scrap in the corner becomes valuable. Broken tools are repaired. Old projects are taken apart so their parts can be reused. Nothing new was added from the outside. Yet the internal organization improves. The same system, under different conditions, shifts its behavior. Your body operates in a similar way. When there is constant input, frequent eating, continuous availability of energy, the internal message is clear. Keep going, keep building, keep processing what's coming in. Under these conditions, cleanup still happens, but it tends to be more limited, more selective, because the system's attention is divided. But when there is a pause in input, even a modest one, the signal changes. The urgency to process incoming resources decreases. Space opens up for internal work. It's not that the body suddenly turns on cleaning like flipping a switch. It's that the balance shifts. Processes that were running quietly in the background become more prominent. This is a subtle point, and it's often misunderstood. The effect doesn't come from deprivation itself, as if the body were being forced into a desperate state. It comes from the change in conditions that allows different processes to take priority. Too little input, and the system begins to struggle. It lacks the basic materials needed to function. Too much input, and the system becomes overloaded. It spends most of its effort handling what's coming in. Somewhere in between, there is a dynamic balance where both building and cleaning can occur over time, not simultaneously in equal measure, but in a kind of rhythm. And that rhythm is not fixed. It shifts from day to day, even moment to moment, depending on what the body is experiencing. What makes this difficult to grasp is that we tend to look for a single rule, something we can apply consistently. But the body doesn't operate on a single rule. It responds to patterns. And the simplest pattern here is this. Periods of input followed by periods of relative absence allow the system to alternate between creating and reorganizing. Nothing exotic, nothing mysterious. Just a system adjusting itself continuously to the conditions it finds itself in. If this pattern is so simple at its core, why does it become so confusing the moment we try to explain it clearly? Part of the difficulty is that we are trying to describe something that we cannot directly see or feel. You cannot sense a protein being broken down. You cannot feel a damaged cellular component being recycled. These processes unfold at a scale far below perception, and they do so gradually, without any sharp boundary between on and off. Because of that, we rely on indirect understanding, measurements, experiments, models. And those tools, while powerful, do not give us a complete picture. What we know comes from careful observation under controlled conditions. Scientists can track markers associated with processes like autophagy, observe how they change under different circumstances, and build a framework of how the system behaves. From that, a few things become reasonably clear. Cells have built-in mechanisms for identifying and recycling damaged components. These mechanisms respond to signals related to energy availability and stress. When resources are abundant, activity tends to favor growth and production. When resources are limited, there is a shift toward conservation and internal reorganization. We also see that chronic overload, constant excess without pause, can interfere with these balancing processes. Systems that are always processing incoming material have less opportunity to redirect attention inward. But this is where certainty begins to fade. Because real human bodies are not controlled laboratory systems. They are influenced by countless variables at once. Genetics, environment, activity levels, sleep patterns, psychological stress, even time of day. Two individuals can experience similar external conditions and still respond differently at the cellular level. So when we ask questions like, how long should the body be in a repair-focused state? Or what is the optimal pattern for balancing growth and cleanup? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. We have clues, we have trends, but we do not have precise universal rules, and this uncertainty creates discomfort. Humans prefer clear instructions, a specific duration, a fixed schedule, a defined method, something that can be followed step by step with the expectation of a predictable outcome. But biological systems resist that kind of simplification. They are adaptive, not mechanical. They respond to conditions, not command. Another layer of difficulty comes from timescale. Many of these processes do not produce immediate noticeable effects. If you change your behavior today, you will not feel cellular recycling accelerating tomorrow in any direct way. The consequences accumulate slowly, often invisibly, over long periods. This makes cause and effect hard to connect. If something feels good in the short term, we tend to assume it is beneficial. If something feels neutral or requires patience, we tend to overlook it. But the systems we are talking about do not operate on the timescale of momentary sensation. They operate continuously, integrating signals over hours, days, and years. There is also the problem of language. Words like clean, toxin, or even repair carry everyday meanings that do not map neatly onto what is happening inside cells. When we use these words, we unintentionally simplify processes that are far more nuanced. This leads to misunderstandings. We begin to imagine the body as something that accumulates dirt in a straightforward way, and that can be reset just as straightforwardly. But at a deeper level, there is no clear boundary between what is waste and what is resource. The same molecule can be useful in one context and harmful in another. The system is constantly reevaluating and reusing its own components. So the challenge is not just scientific, it is conceptual. We are trying to understand a dynamic, self-adjusting system using language and intuitions that evolved for dealing with static objects. And that mismatch makes even simple underlying ideas feel complicated. Not because they are inherently complex at their core, but because our way of thinking is not naturally suited to them. To really grasp what is happening, we have to become comfortable with partial knowledge, gradual change, and the idea that the body is not following a script we can fully write down in advance. It is responding, moment by moment, to a web of conditions, some of which we can influence, and many of which we are only beginning to understand. At this point, there's a strong temptation to turn the whole idea into a rule, something like, if the body cleans itself under certain conditions, then the goal must be to maximize those conditions as much as possible. That sounds logical. It feels like control, but it's also where things begin to go wrong. Because the moment you take a pattern from a dynamic system and push it to an extreme, you stop working with the system and start working against it. Consider again the idea of shifting between building and maintenance. If building is good, then more building should be better, until it isn't. If repair is beneficial, then more repair should be even better. Until that, too, begins to break down the system. This is not a contradiction. It's a property of systems that depend on balance. Take something simple, like water in a landscape. A certain amount of water supports life. Plants grow, soil remains stable, ecosystems thrive. Increase the water too much, and you get flooding, erosion, loss of structure. Decrease it too much, and everything dries out and collapses. The The same variable, pushed in either direction, leads to failure. Biological systems behave in much the same way. If the body is constantly in a state of incoming abundance, always processing, always building, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep up with internal maintenance. Components accumulate damage faster than they are reorganized. Efficiency drops, even if outward activity continues, but if the body is pushed too far in the opposite direction, too little input, too much stress, too much breakdown, it begins to lack the raw materials required to sustain itself. Instead of cleaning and reorganizing effectively, it starts to lose essential structure. So the idea that there is a single optimal state you can hold continuously is misleading. The system does not want to stay in one mode. It wants to move between modes. That movement is not a flaw. It is the design. We tend to look for steady states because they are easier to understand. A fixed routine, a constant condition, something predictable. But the body is not optimized for constancy. It is optimized for adaptability, and adaptability requires variation. This is where oversimplification becomes dangerous. Not in an extreme sense, but in a subtle one. You take a true idea, that internal cleanup processes become more active under certain conditions, then you compress it into a rule. Those conditions should be extended, intensified, or repeated as much as possible, but in doing so, you ignore everything else the system is doing at the same time. You ignore the fact that growth, repair, storage, and breakdown are all interdependent. You cannot isolate one without affecting the others. Even something like autophagy, which plays a central role in recycling cellular components, does not exist in isolation. It is part of a network of processes that must remain coordinated. If one part becomes too dominant for too long, the coordination begins to fail. This is why extreme approaches often produce mixed or temporary results. The system adapts, compensates, and eventually pushes back toward a more balanced state, sometimes in ways that are not immediately obvious. What makes this especially challenging is that the feedback is not always immediate. You can push a system slightly out of balance and not notice the effects right away. Everything appears to function normally until small inefficiencies accumulate and begin to surface later. This delay makes it difficult to connect cause and effect. It also reinforces the illusion that stronger intervention leads to better outcomes. But the underlying reality is quieter and less dramatic. The body is not asking for extremes. It is not asking to be forced into one state or another. It is continuously adjusting, trying to distribute resources across competing needs. Growth, maintenance, storage, defense, and what it responds to are not rigid rules but patterns over time. The simplest useful idea then is not about maximizing any single process. It is about allowing the system enough variation to do all of the things it needs to do, not perfectly, not on a strict schedule, but in a way that avoids being stuck at either extreme for too long, because once you see it this way, the question changes again. It is no longer, how do I push my body to clean more? It becomes something quieter and more difficult to answer. What patterns am I creating, and how is the system responding to them over time? There is another layer to this difficulty, and it has less to do with biology and more to do with how the human mind works. We are uncomfortable with indirect control. If something important is happening, we want a lever to pull, a button to press, a clear action that produces a clear result. But the processes we've been talking about don't work that way. You cannot directly activate autophagy the way you would turn on a light. There is no conscious command you can issue that tells your cells, begin cleaning now. Instead, these processes respond to a web of signals, chemical, energetic, environmental, that together form a kind of internal conversation. And you are not speaking in that conversation directly. You are influencing it through conditions. That distinction is subtle but important. Think about something familiar, like sleep. You cannot force yourself to fall asleep in the same way you can force your hand to move. You can lie down, close your eyes, remove distractions, but the actual transition into sleep happens on its own. If the conditions are right, if the conditions are wrong, too much light, too much noise, too much stimulation, the harder you try, the less it works. The system resists direct control. Cleaning and repair inside the body follow a similar logic. You don't command them into existence. You create an environment in which they are more or less likely to occur. And this is where many misunderstandings begin to take shape, because when people hear that certain conditions favor internal maintenance, they ask for a precise formula. How long? How often? Under exactly what circumstances? They are looking for something they can apply with certainty. But the system they are interacting with is not fixed. It is sensitive to context, the same external pattern. Say, a period of reduced input can produce different internal responses depending on everything else that is happening at the same time. Stress levels, sleep quality, prior activity, overall energy balance. All of these factors modify how the body interprets that pattern. So the idea of a universal instruction begins to break down. This doesn't mean nothing can be understood. It means understanding has to shift from rules to relationships. Instead of thinking in terms of if I do this, then that will happen, it becomes more accurate to think in terms of tendencies. Certain conditions tend to shift the system in certain directions, but they do not guarantee outcomes. This probabilistic nature is uncomfortable because it removes the sense of certainty. You are no longer executing a plan with a predictable result. You are interacting with a system that adapts as you interact with it. There is also a deeper psychological element. Humans tend to focus on visible actions rather than invisible processes. Taking something, adding something, doing something measurable feels productive. Doing less, or simply allowing time to pass under certain conditions, feels passive, even if it is exactly what the system requires. This bias leads to an interesting paradox. The more subtle and essential a process is, the less it feels like you are doing anything to support it. And yet, those subtle processes are often the ones that matter most over long periods. It's similar to maintaining a complex ecosystem. You don't control every interaction between organisms. You don't manage each chemical exchange in the soil. What you can do is influence the overall conditions, light, water, disturbance, and allow the system to organize itself within those boundaries. Your body is in many ways an ecosystem at a different scale. And like any ecosystem, it has its own internal logic. You can disrupt it, you can support it, but you cannot fully dictate its behavior. This is not a limitation in a negative sense. It is simply a reflection of the system's complexity. Once you begin to see it this way, the idea of making the body clean itself starts to dissolve. Not because the underlying processes aren't real, but because the framing is too direct, too mechanical. What actually exists is a continuous negotiation between different needs: input and output, growth and repair, stability and change. And your role in that negotiation is not to issue commands, but to shape the conditions under which those negotiations take place, quickly, indirectly, and always with some degree of uncertainty. There is a quieter shift that happens once you stop trying to control the system directly. The question changes. Instead of asking, "What should I do to make this happen?" you begin asking, "What is already happening, and under what conditions does it change?" That shift sounds small, but it alters how you interpret almost everything. Because once you start observing rather than forcing, patterns begin to reveal themselves. Not as rigid rules, but as tendencies that repeat over time. You might notice, for example, that constant input, food, stimulation, activity, keeps the system occupied. There is always something being processed, something being handled. Nothing is necessarily wrong with that, but there is very little pause. And without pause, certain kinds of reorganization become less likely. Not impossible, just less prominent. Now compare that to periods where input is reduced. Not eliminated, not forced to an extreme, just reduced enough that the system is no longer fully occupied with incoming demands. There is a subtle change, it's not dramatic. There's no clear signal that says, now the body is cleaning. But if you think in terms of competing priorities, it makes sense that when one demand decreases, another has room to expand. Processes like autophagy don't suddenly appear in those moments. They were already there. What changes is their relative activity within the whole system. This idea, that systems redistribute effort based on conditions, is something you can see far beyond biology. Consider attention. If you are constantly interrupted, messages, noise, tasks, your attention fragments. You move quickly from one thing to another. You remain active, but shallow. But if interruptions decrease, even without trying to concentrate harder, your attention deepens. Thoughts connect. You begin to reorganize information, not just react to it. Nothing new was added. Something was removed. The same underlying capacity expresses itself differently depending on the environment. Your body behaves in a similar way, except the processes are hidden from direct experience. This is where another misconception often appears. People assume that if a process is important, they should feel it. But many of the most essential processes in the body are completely silent. You don't feel your cells repairing themselves. You don't feel damaged components being broken down and reused. There is no direct sensory feedback for these events, and because of that, it's easy to ignore them, or to assume they require something dramatic to be activated. But subtle systems do not require dramatic triggers. They require appropriate conditions. Another way to see this is through time. We often look for immediate changes because they are easier to notice. But systems like this operate over longer durations. Small shifts in conditions, repeated over and over, gradually change how the system behaves. One day of altered conditions may not produce anything noticeable, but a pattern sustained over weeks, months, years that begins to shape the system in a more persistent way. This is why observation becomes more useful than short-term intervention. Instead of trying to create a perfect moment where everything aligns, it becomes more meaningful to look at the patterns you are creating over time. Are there periods of continuous input with no interruption? Are there moments where the system is allowed to idle, to redistribute effort, to shift priorities? Not in a strict or scheduled way, but as a natural variation, because the body does not need perfection. It needs enough variation to avoid being locked into a single mode for too long. And that brings the idea into a different kind of clarity. The goal is not to activate something. It is to avoid suppressing it continuously. That's a very different perspective. You are no longer trying to push the system into a special state. You are simply allowing space for the states that already exist to take their turn. And in that sense, the process is less about doing something new and more about noticing what happens when you stop doing certain things all the time. There is one more idea that quietly shapes how all of this is interpreted, and it revolves around a single word that seems simple but is actually misleading: clean. When you hear that word, it probably brings to mind something polished, empty, free of contamination, a surface with nothing on it, a space where all unwanted material has been removed. But inside a living system, that definition doesn't quite work. Your body is not supposed to be empty. It is supposed to be active. At any given moment, there are trillions of molecules interacting, reacting, colliding, transforming. Proteins are folding and unfolding. Cells are communicating through chemical signals. Microorganisms are living, dying, and interacting with your tissues in ways that are still not fully understood. If you could somehow remove everything that might be considered impure or messy, you wouldn't be left with a perfectly clean system. You would be left with a non-functioning one. So in a biological sense, clean does not mean the absence of material. It means something closer to organized activity. It means that components are where they need to be, doing what they need to do, and that damaged or unnecessary parts are being handled in a way that doesn't interfere with the rest of the system. This is a very different definition from the everyday one. It also explains why processes like autophagy are not about removing everything, but about selective transformation. The system is not trying to eliminate all irregularities. It is constantly evaluating which parts are still useful, which parts need to be broken down, and how the resulting pieces can be reused. What counts as waste is not fixed. A molecule that is useless in one context can become valuable in another. Something that appears damaged might simply be waiting to be repurposed. This fluid definition makes the idea of cleaning much harder to grasp. We prefer clear categories: clean versus dirty, useful versus useless. But inside the body, those categories are constantly shifting. Even something as simple as a cell dying is not necessarily a problem. In many cases, it is part of normal function. Old cells are removed so that new ones can take their place. The system maintains itself through turnover, not preservation. So instead of imagining the body as something that accumulates dirt and needs to be periodically scrubbed, it becomes more accurate to imagine it as something that is continuously reorganizing itself. Order is not imposed from the outside. It emerges from ongoing activity. This leads to an interesting consequence. If the system is functioning well, there will still be constant production of byproducts, constant breakdown, constant change. From the outside, nothing will look perfectly clean. But internally, the processes will remain coordinated. And if coordination breaks down, even a system that appears fine on the surface may begin to struggle. So the visible idea of cleanliness is not a reliable indicator. What matters is the invisible balance between creation, transformation, and removal. This is why attempts to force the body into a state of purity often miss the point. They are based on an image of cleanliness that does not apply to living systems. The body does not aim for purity. It aims for continuity. It maintains itself by allowing change, not by eliminating it. And once you see that, the original question, how to make the body clean itself, begins to dissolve into something more subtle. The body is already engaged in an endless process of maintaining order within change. It is not trying to become clean in a final sense. It is trying to remain functional in the middle of constant transformation, and that is a very different kind of clean than the one we usually imagine.